Heddle. Professor, good morning, good afternoon to you. Professor Donna Heddle is director of the UHI Institute for Northern Studies, which is based in Kirkwell, Lerwick, and Perth, with associated members across the UHI networks. That's the University of the Highlands and Islands Network. She has won awards for course development and design. Her research interests are Scottish and Northern Isles cultural history, Renaissance language and literature, and cultural tourism. And so you can see she's well qualified to talk about the general theme of our conference and the notion of how we transmit our heritage through our culture. And this is I think Professor Heddle is a great transition from Rory's discussion into our next panel, which is music. She can kind of help us bridge that transition from culture into a specific art. So, Professor Heddle, would you please, the podium, so to speak, is all yours, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me clearly here from Orkney. As the great Lord Tennyson said, her voice was ever soft, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman, but not necessarily ideal for Skype. So I hope you can all hear me. If you're wondering what the little flag here is at the side of the screen, this is the flag of the Orkney Islands. I thought I would just put it there so you'd get a sense of place, even though I'm not there with you today. Well, I'm very delighted to speak to you today, and I think first of all I'll start by explaining a little bit about what the University of the Highlands and Islands actually is. Now, for 400 years there was a plan to have a university in the Highlands and Islands, and it finally came into being just a few years ago. And what we are is a group of colleges around the Highlands and Islands region who all specialise in different strengths. And our particular strengths are in Northern Studies, which is really looking at area studies, looking at aspects of history, language, literature, cultural history, and so on. And I'm director of the Institute, certainly. I'm also programme leader for our master's programmes, and I'm also head of culture, heritage and tourism at the university. And what we like to think is that we can take our research and make it into something that's really useful, something that's practical, something that's going to sustain the communities we live in, because that's what makes us different. We're actually in the communities, we're for the communities, and we're researching by the communities of the Highlands and Islands area, which makes us very different when it comes to universities across the world in many ways. And actually, our research into cultural history and tourism was judged the 5th best research department in the whole of the United Kingdom. And we're very happy to say that we tied with Oxford and we beat Cambridge. So I'm going to wave my flag there for that one. Whee! Hooray for us. Thank you. We have, if I was teaching the way I'm normally teaching at home, this is how you would see me, because our master's programs, our undergraduate programs go all over the world. You can study them from your own computer. You can study them in the middle of the night if you want. You can study them listening to me directly live from Kirkwell and my colleagues from across the Highlands and Islands network. And that's a wonderful thing. And the people that we're mainly reaching with these degree programs are our Scottish diaspora. They are the sons and daughters of Scotland that are out there in the wider world. But also other people too. It's very interesting. The first student I ever had on our Masters in Orkney and Shetland Studies was Bulgarian. So everybody likes Scotland, everybody's interested, and everybody has their own opinion about what Scottish heritage is. Blimey, if I had £1 for every time somebody said, oh yes, Scotland, that's Tartan, that's the Loch Ness Monster, and that's Sean Connery. Now, I sit on a committee with Sir Sean, and he's very happy to be identified as a Scottish cultural icon, which he certainly is, but it's an interesting mixture. And this is one of the issues that we have when we talk about heritage and culture, and we try and ally them with tourism. Because sometimes there's a difference between what is the truth and what the tourists want to see. And in Scotland, of course, Scotland is perhaps the best ever tourist destination, if you like, because when you come to Scotland, you don't just come to a place, you come to a time. You come back in time. It's no accident, I think, that the best ever American tourist experience is probably encapsulated in the film Brigadoon. And I'm sure some of you will have seen the film Brigadoon with Gene Kelly and Van Johnson. One of my mother's favourites, that was. And at the end, of course, the American is left behind in the past, in the misty glens. And that is very much what people want to find. But we're not just, when we're talking about cultural tourism and heritage, we're not just thinking about what is of interest to tourists who are only going to be here for a day. We're interested in making it into a sustainable and a valuable product that really promotes the wonderful and unique things that make Scotland the 9th most recognised country in the world. We punch well above our weight when it comes to international understanding of Scotland, recognition of Scotland, and of course the way that Scotland has affected people all over the world. And I'm particularly minded of this as yesterday in Edinburgh there was the premiere of the film Outlaw King about King Robert the Bruce, starring Chris Pine, with a very, very good effort at a Scottish accent, ladies and gentlemen. Well done, Chris. Really very good. But also, of course, there's a film in production called First Man, which is about Neil Armstrong. And lest we forget, those of you of Scottish heritage, as a Scots-American that was the first to stand on the moon. And after he'd been the moon, he came back to Scotland to see the place that his father had come from. So the connections are all there. The connections, because we don't just want to promote our heritage just to have tourists coming from a day trip. We want to promote our heritage to help our young people understand the links and the things that make us who we are. You know, we carry our heritage in our faces. You can see my cheekbones here. That's a very Pictish thing there. But we carry our heritage in our names. And sometimes people don't always understand that. I'll come back to that in a minute. We carry our heritage in the food that we like to eat, and we carry the heritage in the tongues that we speak. So I could say to you, Fáilte as Archiv, greetings from Orkney, but if I was going to say it in the language of Orkney, I would say welcome till Orkney Erna, because Orkney is a Norse part of Scotland, of course. So our cultural heritage isn't that easy to define sometimes, and sometimes it's quite amusing. For example, I was very amused with the fact that groundskeeper Willie in The Simpsons is apparently from Kirkwall in Orkney, which is where I'm from. I'm afraid he doesn't sound like it though, so they might need to do a bit of work on that. But it's encouraging to know that we're clearly considered a fighting people. So we ask ourselves, how can we make the lived experience of communities, past, present and future, how can we make it come alive? Not just for the tourists, but for our young people, the people that perhaps don't have the same sense of association that we might have with the past and the understanding of it. And this is actually an issue in Scotland too, because in Scotland, Scottish history is not very much taught in schools. We get British history instead. So for many young people, it's sometimes a revelation when they find out about their past and who they are, and what their languages are, and what their people have done. Speaking to you in America, I'm very much reminded of the Runrig song, Rocket to the Moon, for example, which is a nice link with the music panel later on, I hope. But in that particular song, it is about the emigration of the Scottish people to North America and other places too, and what they achieved when they got there. But sometimes this seems, for many young people, something in the past, something they don't know about, something in the films maybe, and they don't understand that they have that association with them. And you know, when we think about lives, we stand holding hands, if you like, holding the hands of our mothers, holding the hands of our children. And we know that our mothers hold hands into the past and our children will hold hands into the future. There will be a link of humanity, but we only form a little part of it. And sometimes the stories get lost. So the thing we have to ask ourselves is, how can we make the stories come to life? How can we make people understand where they are, what they came from, and where they're going? And that is where the educational programs come in so well, which is why I was so delighted to be asked to speak to you today, because that is one of the big issues that we have with our educational programs, making people understand and appreciate their own heritage. For example, in the north of Scotland, many people didn't think that was a heritage worth valuing. And so when they had their tourism product, that wasn't what they were promoting. They were just promoting things like the Loch Ness Monster and so on, but they weren't promoting the really good stories that were there. And actually, to give you an example, I was recently in Vanuatu. We're working on a tourism qualification with them. And Vanuatu, as I'm sure many of you knowledgeable crowd will remember, was the New Hebrides at one time. And Vanuatu do not promote their own culture at all. When you go for a tourism experience there, they don't tell you because they don't value it and they don't think you'd be interested. And that is a great shame. And that's what we must avoid in Scotland, and also for promoting Scotland abroad. So how to do it then? What do we have to do? Well, I think we have to take away that sense of disassociation. You know, well, let's take names for an example. I do love my names, I must admit. Onomastics is a great interest of mine. But we have names. Young people don't realise that if they have the name Lachlan, for example, they're a Viking. That means the Viking. That's a Viking. The names MacLeod, McSween, all of these names have a meaning that we have lost. It's like place names. When these names, these places were given names, these names meant something to the people that gave them. You know, Thurso here in the north, Kirkwall, which means the Kirk Bay actually, so on, Edinburgh, Dunedin, all of these things meant something and told you something about the place. And for people today, they do not have that sense of connection. They don't have that sense of transgenerational transmission of narrative. And that is where the mixture of culture and the arts can be so useful, can work so well, if we can bring it together. And I think that is where music can be particularly useful. Music and storytelling, and looking again at that lived experience, the things that are real. Research has shown, and some of it is ours, in fact, about cultural tourism, that what people want when they come somewhere is a real experience with real people. They don't want to be taken in a bus round castles and given something with a bit of tartan and some rather dodgy shortbread. They would rather have a real experience with real people. And some of the work that we have done with tour groups and so on, we train up the tourist guides for the north of Scotland and so on, is to make sure that people do meet real people, that they try new things, that they come away with a sense of place. Now, it's actually very important, this, because some of the things I do involves lecturing on cruise ships, and I can see how very quickly you lose a sense of place when you're on a cruise ship. Oh, it's Tuesday, it must be X. You really lose a sense of it. So making that experience something that sticks in their mind, the kind of experience that they've had something that nobody else gets, that it's special. You know, because in the north of Scotland, we have a lot of day tripper tourists, for example, but we have also people who come for a long time. And there is so much here. I mean, let's not forget that the very rocks of Scotland are the oldest in the world. Some of the rocks on the west coast of Scotland are the same as the ones on the moon, so I hope Neil Armstrong recognised them when he got there. But they're incredibly old. This is an old place. You know, there are layers and layers, like one of your wonderful American layer cakes is like that, layers and layers, not just the bedrock, but the people, the community, the folklore, the governance, the animals, everything is there. And some of the ways that you can get it across is in a visual way. For example, here in Scotland, we have a very, very strong gaming industry. And some of the most popular games there, we've actually advised on them, have been to do with traditional culture and so on. Admittedly, there's a fair bit of violence in them, which isn't necessarily my cup of tea, but we try to make sure that the historical bits are accurate. But it's helping people feel that they have some buy-in to the story, that they have some connection to the story. And that is, I think, where music and song and visual arts and things can be so useful. And I'm particularly reminded of a PhD student of mine who's just completed. Her name is Jane Blair McMorrin. Some of you might actually know Jane because she's a member of staff at the Department of Appalachian, Irish and Scottish Studies at East State University in Tennessee. And Jane has just done her PhD, and her topic was the legacy of Ron Gonella. Now, if any of you are keen fiddle fans, you may well remember Ron. Ron was a Scottish fiddler who came to America, and it was Ron that set up the regulations for all the fiddle competitions and so on in America. But what Jane did very cleverly is she reinvented or rebrought Ron back to the audiences both in Scotland and in America, because she showed us how Ron had influenced how Scottish music was treated by the BBC here in Scotland. You know, it was a bit brigadoon, and now it's a wee bit more mainstream. But also Ron had managed to reinvent Scottish music for an American audience and had set the parameters for how people considered music and fiddling. And as we know, that connects very well with the Appalachian heritage there in music as well, and that's a whole other story, I think. But there are many ways that we can reach out, and culture and arts is it's something that people can buy into, they can share. It's a lot easier to sing a song with somebody than it is to sit and listen to a performance, if you know the words. I mean, I was on a march recently, and there were a range of songs being sung, everything from You Cannae Shove Your Granny Off the Bus, and I know John there is very fond of the word granny. He sent me a note about that in his email. But all sorts of songs can bring people together, things where you're taking part. And we've found that some of the most successful ways of getting people to understand their heritage is to get them to do something interactive, that they're involved in, even if it's just baking. If it's just making something. Now, I'm conscious of time and I don't want to run over my lot of time, but I just want to say a quick word about intangible cultural heritage. I'm sure this is something that you're all quite familiar with, but intangible cultural heritage is the kind of cultural heritage that can't be put in a museum. You can't put it in a box. And I remember once being at the European Parliament and somebody asked me, they said, okay, what do you mean by intangible cultural heritage? And I said, okay, do you remember your grandmother making soup? He said, yes. I said, do you remember the smell of the soup? And he said, yes. I said, that's intangible cultural heritage. I said, you can't put that in a box. But the waft of that lovely broth will instantly wheek you back to a cultural memory. It's a bit like Marcel Proust and his Madeleine. I don't know if any of you are fans of Marcel, but he dipped a sponge cake in a cup of tea and it resulted in 5 novels at least. So it's a very powerful thing. So, and it's capturing this and bringing the story to life. And that is why I think things like music and poetry and so on are so important, because not only can you listen to them, you can take part in them and you can create them yourselves. And the most important thing we can do, just to finish up here, the most important thing we can do to help the intergenerational transmission of heritage is allow young people to develop it, to explore it, and then to express it themselves in their own narratives, whatever way they find that they want to do that. The blood is still strong, and we still have a story to tell. Now, I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions for me.
Family and home, and without those, people feel commodified in long-term care. So we've found that intangible cultural heritage has implications not just in the way you described, but the kind of resonant benefit of it is the daughter of a resident in long-term care who comes in and helps prepare a meal, the scent of cookies baking in the oven or a chicken roasting helps her mother feel settled, and she can then go off and be more present and productive in her life. It's not really to do with today's theme, but I felt compelled to kind of underline how important that intangible cultural heritage is. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very valid point. And actually, my mother had a care home as well, so I know exactly what you're talking about with that kind of thing. And I think it is a very important part of things. I mean, the tangible cultural heritage, we could have had a whole conference on it, in fact, but that's a very valuable point, and thank you for making it.
Donna, this is Bob Giles talking to you. I happened to go to the Orkneys a couple months ago for the first time and was very impressed. Skara Brae, Scapa Flow, the Italian Chapel, visited all those great places there. But I'm curious about how you culturally deal with the fact that there's so many Viking artifacts in there, and are you a Scot or are you a Viking?
Oh, now you'll be sorry you asked that, I suspect. Okay, right. In Scotland, we have 4 distinct heritage groups, if you like. In the north, we have the Norsemen, we have the Geltacht, we have the settlers who came up from England, and we have the people, the Picts of the northeast. So all of us in Scotland are a mixture, which is why it was a Scottish author that wrote Jekyll and Hyde, because we can be more than one thing at one time. But in Orkney and Shetland, they were part of Norway for a very long time, and there's a very strong sense of Nordic heritage. My own surname, Heddle, means Hay Valley. It's the same as Heyerdahl, Thor Heyerdahl, the explorer. Some may remember him. And so we can be both Vikings. I can be a Valkyrie and a Scotswoman at the same time, you see. That's the beauty of being Scottish. You can have all these layers. And that's why in our folklore we have things like selkies and shapeshifters, things like that, because we can have these dual identities all the time. So the two things sit quite comfortably together, although we are very proud of our Norse heritage. And that is why our flag has a Norse cross on it.
This is Dave from the House of Scotland in San Diego, California. I'm the Vice President of Membership there, and had a discussion with some here in the room at the dinner last night about the present and translating the Scottish cultural heritage to those that are in their teens, their 20s, their 30s. How do we bring that demographic, that age group, into places like St. Andrew's Society, Caledonian Society, a House of Scotland, and get them to become members now, rather than when they reach their 40s or 50s and then they decide, oh, heritage is much more important to me now. How do we start that heritage engagement much sooner? Is it something that at the table we thought, well, maybe it's something we just can't do? Maybe based upon just human development. As people are young, they want to go out and do their own thing. They want to detach from family and culture and figure things out on their own, and that's fine. And then later on in life, they come back to their heritage, and that's fine too. So we talked about what should our expectations be, but curious to know what your experience might be there.
Well, I think one of the most important things you can do is go into the schools. It may be on St. Andrew's night or something like that, and do a presentation to the class, whether they're of Scottish extraction or not. Because when young people are made aware of these things, children are very open to learning about these things. And we find that we quite often go into schools and give presentations on various aspects of Scottish culture and heritage all over the country. And in fact, in England and other parts of the United Kingdom, because people are quite interested to learn about it. So the schools is the first thing. The other thing is it's got to be cool, right? I'm afraid it's got to be cool. So one thing that we did that worked very, very well is we had a battle of the bands. And that is where young people in bands or playing musical instruments can come together, and then there's a panel and they judge who's the best, and there's a modest prize of some kind. And we found that we got a lot of people coming up to that who weren't necessarily coming because they were Scottish. They were coming because it looked like a good night out, or that happened to be Scottish. And, the bands weren't necessarily traditional bands or anything like that, but it got them together and it got them talking. Also, of course, very simple things I'm sure you've already thought of, it's things like Facebook page, Twitter groups, Instagram. Is a very good way of doing that. I have got quite a following of people who are quite interested in when I post up interesting Scottish designers, clothing and things like that. And that doesn't mean a bonny wee tartan shawl. It means some of the more modern things, like our First Minister wears. She always wears Scottish designers. So I quite often post up various pictures of that. And I have quite a distinct following that, who are not, they're interested, and it's Scottish, that's interesting, but mainly it's because it's, and then they follow my other accounts, which have got more to do with history and things like that, and because they're interested to know why is it that way. The thing is, if you can get them asking questions, you can get them up why is it, say you had a band night and there was a prize, and this one band has bagpipes. One band has one bagpipe, and let's face it, it worked for AC/DC, right? Worked very well for AC/DC. You could be telling them about the bagpipes. There could be a handout about the bagpipes. There could be somebody who's just explaining about that. Because Young people are very inquisitive. They have questions. They like to know things. They also like to discover things that other people don't know that are new and interesting. So really, it's using the social media, which we do a lot in our department, I would have to say, because we have students all over the world, and that's how we keep in touch with them. And we do all sorts of different fun things with that. Also, you could put out, if you had a Facebook page, you could put out a quiz. And see, people love filling in Facebook quizzes. I, for example, I've got a terrible weakness for these Disney ones. Which Disney princess are you? Well, apparently it's Belle from Beauty and the Beast. Because I have brown hair and read books, I worked that one out. But the fact is that people are used to doing that. In the modern era, people are used to filling in things online. They're used to clicking on things. You need to have something that's going to make them click into something else, like I do with my fashion thing, which is just very light-hearted, of course. But they then can click onto something else and find out a bit more. And that's what it is. That's how it works nowadays. It's a far cry from when we were young, I think, and things were very different. But that's how you get them. You do something that's going to be interesting. You go and get them first. You go out and speak to them, and then you create an environment online where they feel comfortable, where they can engage with various aspects of things, and then you have an event.
My name's Nicola Phillips. I'm from the Scottish Club of Tulsa. What you said about, I'm going to go back to the intangible cultural heritage, that was incredibly powerful, really spoke to me. It's incredibly powerful for Scottish tourism, but I also think it's a key component for our youth out here too. Experiences are very important, and so if we can, use some intangible cultural experiences for our young people, they love to say, I did that. And with the bands, we have increased our participation with young people and families by doing just that. Events like bowling in kilts with pipers, where we basically take over a bowling alley, get the pipers out there, have everybody wear kilts. The locals are like, what's going on here? Who are these people out in the kilts? And oh my goodness, listen to those pipers. People are seeing what we're doing, and it's encouraging family activities. And there's lots of other things we can do, cooking classes, and we've got an art place called Pino's Palette. I don't know if that's a national thing, but basically you turn up to a little cafe, you drink wine, and you paint things. We need to get those businesses participating and do some Scottish paintings and get the kids involved in that as well, because kids love art. So there's so much opportunity there for those kids and young people to say, hey, I did that. I was part of that.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's very useful too is to draw young people's attention to things that are Scottish that they maybe don't realise are Scottish. For example, Game of Thrones, the actor playing Robb Stark is a Scottish actor, Richard Madden. And he's very popular with young ladies, I believe. So there are all sorts of, I was having a conversation recently with a friend from Sweden, and we were talking about, there's a wonderful exhibition on at the moment in Edinburgh about Scottish rock music. And we were talking about bands, and I'm mentioning various bands, and she said, I had no idea they were Scottish. I said, oh yes, absolutely. And she said, Rod Stewart is proud of his Scottish heritage. I said, yes, was the tartan trousers not a giveaway at all? But she said she hadn't realised. So sometimes it's quite fun just to put a did you know on your website now and again, or just change it, to an interesting fact. For example.
One more question.
My name is Ian Hunter, and I was wondering, has Scottish academia established a catalog or index of sources that we could identify illustrations of Scottish culture yet?
Oh yes, well, we have a depository of that sort of thing at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Most universities would have something like that now. See, the great thing about using technology for teaching is it means that when the student comes on to the program, they have a whole what's called a virtual learning environment with all the resources and all the links to these things there. And they also have classes, like I'm speaking to you now. Obviously, for much longer, but they also have classes as well. But they have all of these resources there for them. For example, we offer resources in Highlands and Islands culture, Scottish heritage, Orkney and Shetland studies, Highlands and Islands literature, Viking studies, which is very popular, I can tell you, and also Scottish culture and heritage at undergraduate level. And these are all very, very much backed up with links to resources that can be used. Because if we don't valorise our communities, if we don't valorise our heritage, who will? If we don't use our own tongues to speak for ourselves, nobody will speak for us. So we think that's very important. We take that very seriously in our creation of resources, and so indeed do other Scottish universities.
Heddle, we really appreciate the presentation this morning. It was very informative. We are going to take a short break before we start our music panel. You're certainly welcome to remain with us, but I do know that you've got some family issues this afternoon, and if you need to go, we fully understand. If you want to remain online, that's fine too. Certainly, if you wish to leave, Pete will help you exit. But again, thank you so very much. And if we could give her a hand of applause.